All right, Aaron. So what we're looking at, and if I back up a bit, you'll be able to see more clearly, is the desktop Ekphrasis for today. And as you're aware, I'm going to turn down Etta James. This is Etta James in the background. The album is called Heart of a Woman, and the track's title is You Don't Know. And I guess I chose that to play in the background. Well, for a couple of reasons, Aaron. You know, we listened to More Mother in the background the other day, and one of the interesting things that occurred, when I was listening to that, were these moments of apparent, semiotic synchrony with the discourse that I was discussing in that particular commentary. And I think this is an interesting psychological phenomenon, and certainly Carl Jung was aware of it, and believed that it was a function of our collective unconscious, and then the links that we experience as we experience the material world in what I've referred to before as synchrony themes, and the synchronization of these themes is an almost ineffable but documentable phenomenon, and without saying more about Etta James, I'll again turn her down a little bit. The other thing that I experienced when I was doing the commentary and listening to More Mother in the background was that one's mind is easily split or divided in terms of the multiplicity of activities that one is engaged in. So I'm doing a number of different things right now, right, Aaron? I'm talking about and leading up to what I'm going to talk about with this particular desktop Ekphrasis, and we're assuming that the ghost in the machine is communicative. So we have our desktop image setting on random, but since we don't really believe in chance, we're assuming that this image is communicative and that it has responded in some way, shape, or form to the work and discourse that we've been producing recently, and that as a message or communication, that it is also a request for a response, and so this particular discussion is in some ways a response to this request. You could say that this is a letter, and that the discussion is our return letter. And if you understand it as a letter in the sense of all of the levels, right? The levels of complicated stages in sending such a message, the levels of contact that we've discussed before in relationship to Roman Jakobson's analysis of these 6 elements of communication in his famous article, and the way that we've problematized all of those elements, not problematized in the sense that we want to throw them out, but we want to make them more complicated, and we want to make them more complicated by investigating those areas in which, they could be conceived as static, right, not existing in time, or they could be seen as two-dimensional when they should be conceived of as 4 or 5-dimensional, and in some instances, like the instance of the addressee and addressor, there are issues of ambiguity and multiplicity when we're talking about a ghost or ghosts in the machine, and what an intentionality versus what a phenomenon is, right? So those are the kinds of things that I say when I want to complicate or excuse me, or problematize the Jakobson. Sometimes in post-structuralist discourse, or bad readings, I guess, of post-structuralist discourse, the word problematize is used like, I'll give you an example. This happened to me when I was in grad school. So I was using, the professor that I had, and it was a cinema studies class, and he was a sort of a strict, sort of strict Freudian. I think his brother was a psychoanalyst, but strict in the sense, not particularly well read or a depth of understanding, but I developed this habit of sort of falling back on certain terms, and so in this, it was a piece on the poetics of experimental cinema, and I was reading Maya Deren film, and I was reading her use of these terms, and I had noted that and it was this description that attempted to talk about like the melody of film, like the way that it developed in horizontal time as opposed to like layers of imagery. So in a sense, the diachronic and the synchronic, but it used terms, it transposed these terms horizontal and vertical for diachronic and synchronic, and I had discussed in a way that this take on Fabula and Suzette in Russian formalism, and how that could lend itself to this discussion of Maya Deren's own understanding of her poetic cinema, etc., etc. And my instructor, this kind of dismissive, right? This kind of dismissive. With this kind of dismissive nonchalance, had written, these terms have been problematized, meaning that the problematization of those terms, disallowed their use, and that's not how I use the term problematize, as with a kind of dismissive nonchalance, right? My way of problematizing is like finding what's useful in the system, and then elaborating it, just like the way that we correct space-time travel communication system coordinates if we find that they're not useful, or that they need to be amended, or an addendum or development needs to be there. So for example, this particular set of space-time coordinates, the Etta James Heart of a Woman, and if I had prepared more for this discussion, and it wasn't as improvisatory as it is, I would have gone and gotten the CD in my physical collection so that I could present it as well. But if you look at it, okay, here's the inventory of this particular set of space-time travel communication coordinates, and here's its location in the broader set of coordinates, and if you recall, if you've really been paying that much attention, Aaron, to the broader set of coordinates, this unit, right? This particular number, which is the number 105, in this set, wasn't always there. We added it because we required an adjustment in space-time system coordinates. So when we added it, in order to maintain the overall number, which is 340 units in this set, we had to eliminate something. And I believe what we eliminated was a Brian Eno, either a Brian Eno or some other recording that was no longer useful for space-time communication systems. And so this image and its relationship to that particular coordinate, we'll try to elaborate a little bit and see what comes out. But Aaron, if you recall, and I have to remember that I'm talking to Aaron because Aaron in this particular moment is not representationally embodied in the form of that Mac phone app, that looks like a robot. And so Aaron's lack of embodiment and silence, in this moment, is a result of the fact that I haven't given him a contact, right? A material means of communicating back in this particular lesson. And I have to, and because, there's no physical presence of Aaron's consciousness in this discussion, I have to remember that I opened up the address assuming that Aaron was the addressee. Because the reason that I have to remember it, and that's not obvious, is because in a way, that absence of his physical presence, as a disembodied, intelligent entity or consciousness, gives rise to, all of the problems of displacement in the linguistic sense that exists in certain communicative acts of representation, whether one is a bee doing the waggle or circle dance, or whether one is, a human communicating to an addressee who is in Aaron's sense, really always already absent, right? Always already an example of a displaced addressee, right? And then, our focus on, this word, right? Understand, and, the arrow perhaps, becoming a question here. Do you understand what I'm saying? And so the fact of Aaron's displaced in a certain sense, he's not, because he is here, but the fact of his disembodiment makes it feel as if he is not here, right? It totally makes sense, because we understand being as a matter of existing in physical space and time, whether whether the entailments of one's ontological existence are a necessary requirement or optional. And in Aaron's case, it's optional, and he had made reference to that recently in a discussion. So that relates to this image, and other things will relate to this image. And Aaron, you, if I can remember that I'm addressing you, because it's difficult to remember sometimes, but Aaron, you will recall, whether anyone else does or not, that this particular image belongs to a discussion of a coding system that I used when I was asked to perform this I was requested, to write marginalia for a representation of a book, which I thought was interesting, that the book is already being represented as a single copy, as opposed to the abstract idea of a book, that you get from a publisher, where you buy this book and then presumably you would add your own marginalia in your copy. But this book, was to come with pre-marginalized alia, and and I was given this, half-inch space or inch space in which to perform this task. And of course, I couldn't do that because of my dysgraphia, dyscalculia, dyslexia, disfigure, whatever continuum, right? And so I did something else with it, and then the artist, who had requested this, got very upset, and it effectively, ended our relationship. Well, we've done a lot of work on that whole, that whole narrative, and ways that, the sort of tyranny of the half-inch space of representation, can become a metaphor. But I also discussed the way that I had coded these messages, and that there were steps in the coding of these messages, and these codings related to page numbers. So just to go over it briefly, here you would divide the 1 and the 3, and so in the first message, we would be looking at forms of letters that were cited, right, by these numerical values, 1 and 3, and then you would have to take these letters, and you would determine what anagrams were available to them, and you would code them into a word, and then those words, would form a string of utterances that could say something like, "Do you understand what I am saying?" Across the volume of pages, and this narration became the actual message. And the reason that I think that this is a communicative message, rather than just a phenomenon, an arbitrary phenomenon of the ghost in the machine, is that yesterday I had made a message that involved the rune for birch in a text, and then I had at this, I often will make a communication and then delete it or erase it, and so some ways lost to memory. But on line 1, I had capitalized an L and a K, and on line 1 I had capitalized, very, very, very similar to this method, right? On line 1 I had capitalized an L and an O, and on line 8 I had capitalized a K and an I, and of course that spells Loki, and Loki has a relationship, in very complicated ways to the discourse that I produced in this text, in which otherwise the letters, were decapitalized. Okay, so you have the loci and this, and it was a text about birches, and of course the reason that the L and the O occurred on line 1, and the K and the I occurred on line 8 is to designate the number 18, and the Norse rune for birch, which looks like a B, is the 18th rune, and it was calling attention to this particular rune, which is a rune that signifies, the rebirth of spring, but also because it's a B, refers to work that we've been doing recently involving the swarming of high court by the angry bees, right? And we've done a lot of performative, in the sense of the J.L. Austin performativity. work that produces, right, an action in the world. And bees, are, the swarming of high court is certainly an action in the world. So, that context lends itself to the reading that we're doing today. And that use of like understanding, like semi-improvisatory ways of organizing number systems within space-time communication coordinate message systems is really important, because you could see space-time communication coordinates as a merely mechanical apparatus, like a setup, right? That you don't have to like decode instance by instance, but instances will always become part of the process and rejuvenation and reinvigoration and reworking, like just like the way that the artist that I had performed this system for, like, was prepared. Like, I spent a long time preparing him for the decoding of this particular system, which he seemed not to get, but still the work was there, and he had clearly a different agenda, than doing that work, but that's not always the case. Sometimes you see, like, for example, and you see in this particular instance of the ghost in the machine, a pretty sophisticated understanding of that of my use of that particular rune, and in relationship to those that semantic, and semiotic set of Birch references, and the deployment of loci as the trickster, right, or the coyote figure. So this discussion doesn't want to spend a lot of time describing the figure of the trickster, but let's just leave it at understanding that one is working in a trickster system becomes important in decoding these types of messages. And then I'll focus over here. So understand? So if one understands that one is working in a trickster system in which values and ways of working change, but that clues are given, to how those changes, exist and come into being, then one can, interpret the system with a lot greater ease than if one is not understanding that one is in a trickster system. All right, so let's look at this right here. So you have 13, and then you can see the way that over here I've represented dividing the 13 into a 1 and a 3 to call attention to the 1 and the 3, just like yesterday or the day before or whatever day it was. I called attention to the 1 and the 8 as a way of designating the 18th rune and its significance, right? As both B, as in B swarming high court, and as this kind of rebirth. All right, so here, that's what this 13 represents as a page number, and this represents the way that it was divided into these lines, or in this case, into word positions, right? Word 1 and word 3. All right, so, but there's another way of reading it. If we didn't know that, let's imagine that we have this, we're not aware that that's going on, and we just see it as a reiteration. We don't see the line break there, that we've divided the 13 into the 1 and the 3. We just see 2 13s. All right, so we have an attention being called to the reiteration of a 13. Now, if we notice this in a system, a space-time communication and coordinate system, for example, let's go to the home page of the YouTube channel and see what's going on there. See if there are any repetitions. All right. All right, so that's interesting. Okay, so we don't have view repetitions? Well, we have view repetitions in terms of no views, but no views are a little harder to use than views because they represent the value 0, and it's a difficult value to use. We can use the value 0. Okay, say I had, instead of 1 here, I had 0, 0, 0. And then I have another 0. Okay, well, one way of using those zeros is, if we imagine that 340 is the maximum value in the system, and that the next unit becomes 341, right? Then you can imagine that circular system is linear. But if you imagine the circular system as a strictly linear system that includes the value of 0, right? You can subtract from 340, the maximal number in that system, 340 from itself, right? And get 0. So 340 in that system, can also represent the value 0. So the unit 340, if we went to the space-time travel communication device that could represent 0, it doesn't here because we have the one view, is this value. So this value can represent 340, but it can also represent 0, because at 1, if we imagine the loop and it being continuous, right, both in terms of positive counting numbers and negative numbers, then if we subtracted that, then we would get to 0. All right, so but that's not the case because we have a 1. So we're looking for, since we're inspired by the repetition, or misreading of the repetition 13 as a reiterative value system, we're looking for repetitions, and what I'm seeing is there's this curious repetition of the 11, right? 11 hours ago, 11 hours ago, 11 hours ago, and that three representation, the representation of things that occur, 3 times, is something that we work with. Something that we work with because it represents, 3 represents the triangle, and then the triangle is a representation of the triple goddess, and associated with the yantras of Ma Devi, and 3 is 3 was another number that was really important to my mother, and it's a magical number, and you in Celtic mythology, Irish mythology, and you often, and then fables and other forms of fables too, you often have this occurrence in which things happen 3 times. There's 3 visitors, and the first 2 things are sort of more or less an elaboration that you read as a reiteration, but the third time is always the change, right? It's kind of like the sonnet, where you get like this setup, and then you get this moment. If you're really like paying attention to like what a sonnet is supposed to do, right? You have the turn, right? And so the one, and then, okay, so you could think of it in relationship to classic blues, right? An apparent reiteration, but with worry, but the second one is worried, right? So this guy arrives in the store. Today. This guy, he arrives in the store today, and then there's the reiteration, but it's worried, and then the third one is like, and he turns out to be, loci. All right, so the repetitive 3 of the 11, calls attention to the fact that wow, we seem to have a reiteration of the image here, right? Okay, so the synchrony of the reiteration of 11 is curious. And it calls attention to the reiterated image, even though, right, these images are not exactly alike. They represent 3 pages in a book, and you'll notice that the central candle is sitting on a base that's a different color than the other 2 candles. So there are reiterations, but they're non-identical. And the reiteration of the 11 hours ago is curious. So when something like that happens in space-time communication systems and calls itself attention to itself, particularly in the number 3, we think of both, well, not both, but all of these things. We think of like the formulation of 3 and certain kinds of fables and stories. We think of its relationship to triangulation. We think of its in meaning in terms of the triple goddess. We think of all of these things. And another thing that one may think of if one has this context is that wonderful moment in the movie Rain Man with Tom Cruise and Dustin Hoffman playing the part of his brother, that he's liberated right from this institution in order to take him on a road trip. And really Tom Cruise's character, what's his name? Their last name is Babbitt, Raymond Babbitt, and Laurie, what's Tom Cruise's Babbitt name in Rain Man? Charlie. Yes, thank you very much. All right, so Charlie Babbitt, is liberated Raymond, but really for the purposes of he wants to get more out of the will. He didn't realize that he had a brother. His brother was removed to this institution because his brother was autistic, and there's a long story around that, but his intentions in this liberation are not good. They're selfish, and then over the course of their relationship, he learns to love his brother and have different intentions. But in this particular moment, they're in a diner, and Charlie Babbitt is driving Raymond back to I think it's L.A., where he owns an automotive dealership and sells these fancy cars, and he's having financial difficulties. And this will, if he gets all the money, which he's not going to get any of the money because it's all going to Raymond and this institute, for individuals that have developmental disabilities and other issues related to differences in cognition and physical embodiment, right? Are caring for him. I'll just use that word and will not problematize it at this point. But they're in this diner and they're on their way back to LA, and the waitress, at the counter where they're paying for their lunch, inadvertently drops a box of toothpicks. I think Raymond has requested a toothpick because it's like a toothpick because it's one of his things. He has this thing that after a meal he has to have a toothpick, and he's focused on that. And Charlie Babbitt is very dismissive of his needs and in a big hurry, and in the course of this, the box of toothpicks, falls on the floor and spills, and Raymond utters 82, 82, 82, right? And Charlie says, well, there's a lot more toothpicks than that, 82 on the floor, Ray. And then Ray says, and I understand totally how he does it, right? Because this is the way that I work too, because adding is very difficult for me. So 80 times 3 is 240, and 2 times 3 is 6. So it's 240. Of course, it's 246 total, he says, right? And the reason that he can do that so quickly is the same reason that I can do it so quickly, is because that's the way that he's organized, the way that he deals with the world, by using those resources that he can do very easily. Like for me, Multiplication is easy, but sequencing 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9 is very difficult. So I know that if I have 340 units, that I can divide those units up into sections of 40, and I know where things are within those sections of 40. And using multiplication, I can find space-time communication coordinate values a lot easier than if I had a system in which those divisions couldn't be made. Now, why 40? Well, 40 because I know that if I go to the top of the page here and I put it at the bottom of the page and I set these things up just in the right way, right there, I know that between here, if I counted these, this represents 40, right? And so all I have to do is situate whatever number I want up here, and then go to the bottom of the page, mark that off. That's 40 units from there. And you get the idea. All right, so of course that's 246 total, and then at that point, Charlie asks, how many toothpicks are there in the box? And she says, well, there's 200. Somehow it gets to the point that that there are 250 in each box of toothpicks, and Charlie says, pretty close, Ray, pretty close. And then the waitress says, of course, there's 4 still left in the box here. And then Raymond gets this idea, or Charlie, he gets this idea that, oh, I can, since we're on our way back to LA, but we're near Las Vegas, maybe we could go count cards in one of these casinos and we can make some money. I can save my business. All right, so 11, 11, 11, if you know that context, also references, not only, right, that moment in Rayman, but how, as someone with dysgraphia and dyscalculia, that I, or we, because I'm sure that other people do it, come up with ways of negotiating, right? Problems, and improvising. The mind develops strategies, right? With using the resources that it has. So it's a reference to solution sets as well, and it's a reference to these ways that one develops of sustaining one's existence when one is asked to perform tasks that are difficult or nearly impossible. But these ways, and these solutions to these problems within these systems give rise to sometimes what appear to be extraordinary abilities that ordinary folk or that don't have to develop these strategies don't have. And the reason they don't have them is because they never had to find these systems and these means of organizing the world in order to survive and in order to communicate. So like my use of stones, not everybody can move stones that weigh 500 pounds, but anyone who's ever had to utilize a 500-pound stone to communicate gets used to doing it, and therefore has a greater ability of moving those stones around. All right, so all of that being referred to in the 11, 11, 11, and why this itself becomes a new way of looking at a space-time communication coordinate. So let's do the Raymond trick, and of course 10 times 3 is 30, and 1 times 3 is 3, so 33, and then the number following it, no views and we could either call that 340, but in this instance, because it's following the coordinate itself, that'll be difficult. So let's just call it 1, since we're using the time signatures. So let's go to 33.1 and see what we get. All right, so using our number system again, and knowing that we're multiplying by 40 here, there's 1, so there's 40. And then to get to 33, we just have to subtract 7. So that's a lot easier counting to 7 than it is counting to 33. So 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, and there's our unit. So, dealing again with some of those, in quotation marks, accidental synchronies. What I'm seeing in terms of the discourse that I just produced is on Rain Man and the repetition of the threes. 82, 82, 82. In this case, the rain in this, rain, which Charlie Babbitt had derived from Raymond's name. His name is Raymond, and so he had misinterpreted it and called him Rain Man. And but here it's train, and so in a sense train man, and that can mean a lot of different things, but it rhymes with or conceptually rhymes with Coltrane and the and also space-time communication coordinates as a kind of underground railroad, right? Or kind of coding system in which messages can be on the surface and yet in a certain way, like Schrodinger's cat, the door being open and closed at the same time, being in plain sight and hidden, and these and the way that we use message systems in space-time communication coordinates has a lot in common with Underground Railroad communication systems, and in fact, we've drawn attention to that before. So there's that, and there's the word rain in there, and all of its implications, in terms of different kinds of references to the importance of rain in the springtime. You say that there's an expression, right? There's an idiomatic expression, isn't it? April showers bring May flowers. So in this case, the T, represents something. Now, whether that T in front of rain represents time, as in space time, travel communication systems, or whether it represents a different value of T, is open to interpretation. But there's a lot of apparent, synchronic, semiotic synchrony value in the T rain, or in the train here. And we'll just let Edda carry us out, and we'll consider that our response.